Hello all, my name is Benjamin Ellers, and I'm going to tell you why your library does not need a makerspace. This is a somewhat unorthodox position coming from me, someone who has spent most of their career involved with education, computer science, and piloting makerspace programming in libraries. Let me be clear, I love makerspaces. I love what they represent, and I love what they do. But they also can be intimidating, resource-intensive money pits that present an enormous opportunity cost even when done well. My key message is this. You do not need a makerspace to accomplish any of the outcomes associated with makerspaces. By carefully considering your available resources, the needs of the community, and the most effective ways to link those two things together, you can achieve all the same outcomes. First off, let's take a quick look at what makerspaces are. The Oxford English Dictionary, my favorite way to start any presentation, defines a makerspace as a place in which people with shared interests, especially in computing or technology, can gather to work on projects while sharing ideas, equipment, and knowledge. That sounds reasonable, but I am going to share a couple others just so we can push back on that a little bit. Makerspaces.com defines the term as a collaborative workspace inside a school, library, or public or private facility for making, learning, exploring, and sharing that uses high-tech to no-tech tools. And finally, the Cambridge Dictionary shares a similar perspective, a place where people can come together to create or invent things, either using traditional crafts or technology. The key elements that these definitions share are fairly obvious. 1. There are people. 2. These people are engaged in making and creating stuff. And 3. There's an opportunity for people to share knowledge related to the stuff that they are doing with other people in that space. I mean, really, if you take a step back from the emphasis on the specific place, these ideas apply equally well to any good library program, and everyone here has plenty of experience running those. So, let's take a look at the tips. Tip 1. We are all makers. This is what the Oxford definition underemphasizes and why I love the Cambridge definition so much more. Making isn't all about robots and coding. It's also music, knitting, trading seedlings, whittling, pickles, car repair, homebrewing beer, and on and on. Making is, at its heart, the act of taking control over the manufacture and maintenance of stuff, anything really. Implicit in the act of taking control of these processes is the acquisition of a host of other valuable, transferable skills, including project planning, problem solving, and creativity. And yes, creativity is absolutely a learnable skill. As I go through this presentation, I will throw around buzzwords like 3D printers, robots, or Steam, but these are just terms that are artifacts associated with makerspaces. We should always try to connect back to the defining characteristics of what that space I just said to you that you don't need is. And that's people coming together to make things. The biggest reason I personally feel this message is important is that makerspaces, especially those described by the Oxford English Dictionary with their emphasis on technology, are kind of implicitly coded as male spaces. And moreover, by excluding traditional manifestations of knowledge, a lot of people are discouraged from seeing themselves as users of those spaces. For example, one time I found myself talking about 3D printers with a coworker. This tech stuff is too complicated and goes way above my head, she would say. And yet, she was also an accomplished sewer and was able to thread a sewing machine with her eyes closed. The complexity of these two machines aren't all that far removed, and by emphasizing the knowledge that she had already developed throughout her life, I was able to show her that this was just a different manifestation of a process she had already mastered. Which leads me to point 2. Tip 2. Things do not teach kids to code. People teach kids to code. I say code here, but it applies equally to any skill. There have been thousands of products out there that make exactly this promise, teaching kids to code. I've had the pleasure of putting many of these products in front of kids, occasionally my own, and almost without exception, none of these platforms have, on their own, taught kids how to code. If these products lived up to their marketing hype, we would be awash in a sea of web developers right now. The most important element of a makerspace isn't the equipment. It's the people that gather there to build and share knowledge, and this includes staff. It doesn't matter how much you spend on something if you don't have a structured, scaffolded, and fun series of programming to support it. The first major barrier to getting quality programming isn't your shopping list, it's cultivating the requisite knowledge to facilitate positive learning outcomes. Does this mean that you or your staff need to go out to night school for computer science? No. Remember tip 1? We are all makers, and there is room to explore anything and everything. Your best resource is your staff. Start with their passion projects and find ways to build and develop knowledge around that. It's also worth reaching out to local high schools, colleges, universities to find student mentors. You might even find school faculty that are willing to help out. And finally, you can also look for volunteers within your larger community. They already possess a wide range of expertise that may not include stuff like web development, but what about bicycle mechanics, welders, bakers, carpenters, gardeners? Even if they can't donate their time, they might be able to help with equipment donations or broker access to other spaces like workshops and kitchens. Tip 3. Know what outcomes you want to support before you invest. Focus on the goals and ask yourself, what is it that I want people to walk away with? Okay, story time. Once upon a time, we had invested in 10 Raspberry Pi kits with the idea that people would use them to learn to code. Once we unboxed the first one, we started to really get a sense of how short-sighted we were. Each Raspberry Pi also required a monitor, so you could see what you're doing, and an HDMI cable to connect it up to the Pi, and a mouse so you can click around stuff, and a keyboard so you can type in commands, an Ethernet cable because you need the internet, but that means you need a router to plug that into, and you also need an SD card configured with the operating system so you can do all this stuff, which of course needs to be downloaded an image using a different computer, which means you also need to have an SD card reader to do that. And then of course if you want sound, you need speakers or a monitor that supports HDMI audio, and so after getting all of that together, you can finally sit down and begin the process of learning how to code. Or we could have just used the computers we already had lying around, or our phones, or anything really. If the goal was just coding, the Raspberry Pi is a very inefficient way of getting there. Don't get me wrong, Raspberry Pis are amazingly powerful pieces of equipment, but they were poorly aligned with our goal. We confused get stuff to help people learn to code with our actual goal, which was help people learn to code. So, what works? If you want kids or people to learn to code, Scratch is amazing and free. Seriously, if you have never played around with it, clear your weekend calendar and dive into it. Twine is another great way to introduce scripting in HTML through the lens of choose-your-own-adventure interactive fiction. Let's take a look at another popular Makerspace equipment category. Want to focus on robots? Great! But let's break it down a little bit. Are we talking about building robots or programming robots? Or are we talking about physical computing, which is interfacing code with sensors and motors that respond and influence their environment? Each outcome has a different set of tools that best supports these approaches, but when your tools aren't easily aligned with your outcomes, the impact of your programming might suffer. Which leads me to tip 4. Make your purchases flexible. Like Alton Brown's advice when purchasing kitchen gadgets, you want to avoid unitaskers, which he defines as tools that are only good at one job and inevitably take up precious space. Autobots are cute, but they are not deep. The majority of their use will consist of kids scribbling a few lines on a sheet of paper or the table and then calling it a day. Cubelets are great, but most kids will just smash them all together and see what happens and then get bored. Spheros will, on average, spend 92% of their battery life spent being driven around like a remote control car. Bloxels make a bold promise around designing video games, but most kids will realize that it's easier to just use the app, and now you're stuck with 1,000 plastic cubes that aren't even good at the job they were designed for. Steam programming is more than just playing with toys, although I do not want to discount the importance of play for the sake of play. Moreover, for anyone in the audience right now that has some of these things sitting in your closet, I am being a little bit hard on them. All of these platforms I mentioned can serve as a substrate for quality learning, which we are focusing on thanks to tip 3, know your outcomes. But you might have to work harder to dovetail them into supporting other learning outcomes. For example, exploring variables with an Ozobot is doable, but there are way better ways to introduce the topic. In the end, you want to consider a platform's full range of applications, learning outcomes, and target demographics before making any purchases. If the choice was between 5 Chromebooks or a laser cutter, ask which tool supports a broader range of programming. Caterpillars are great, but they only have a narrow appeal to kids pre-K to grade 2 or so. Here's an example of what I mean by flexibility. I've used LEGO EV3 kits to facilitate programming for kindergartners through to adults. The adult stuff is easy. As you're observing right now, adults are quite content to be lectured at for hours on end, though I promise I'll keep this short. What I love about LEGO Robots is that it is a full package that includes everything from simple engineering through to advanced computer science and every combination and permutation in between. So when I was using LEGO Robot kits with kindergartners, I just kept it simple, focused on building things that moved in order to get the kids used to the way that the bits all work together. We ditched the robot brains and focused on building soapbox derby gravity-powered rolling vehicles. Kids are encouraged to iterate on their designs, borrow ideas from each other, experiment with different techniques, and then later that same kit was used by some teens to build a machine that launched paper airplanes. Put another way, flexible equipment can be adapted to meet the learning objectives you want to prioritize, rather than forcing you to adapt your learning outcomes to the limitations of your equipment. Flexible purchasing also applies to the infrastructure of your library. There's a reason my presentation's titled, "You Don't Need a Makerspace," and that's because there are all sorts of creative ways to pack tons of functionality into libraries of every shape and size. Get everything with wheels attached. It's a lot easier to clear out an area to work if the tables can roll away. If it doesn't come with wheels, think about putting wheels on them. Or put those things on other things that have wheels, like a book cart or a trolley. Have a healthy collection of extension cords to get power to every corner of your library. You don't need a makerspace when any space can be a place for learning. Tip 5. Beware of hidden dependencies. Bloxels require an app to work, which means you need iPads. The new LEGO Mindstorms Inventor Kit requires new Macs because the software won't run on old operating systems. Remember that story I told you about the Raspberry Pis earlier? They were basically a treasure map for hidden costs. Dependencies can also lead to chunks of your investments becoming obsolete. We once bought a number of iPad stands so we could facilitate stop-motion animation programming using the LEGO stop-motion app. LEGO then later killed the app, and there were no alternatives that were as good for our target audience. And thus, the iPad stand sat in the closet for a long time. The biggest hidden dependency? Staff capacity and knowledge. An Arduino kit is a pretty powerful learning platform, but unless you have a staff member who has been given the time and space to learn how to debounce a switch, that kit's going to have a much more difficult time making a meaningful connection with your patrons. When you introduce a new piece of kit into the library, make sure that everyone has a chance to interact with it. Give ample off-desk time to read the manual, start a project. Let them take it home for a week. Incorporate it into a staff meeting. Facilitate an office challenge. I've seen stuff languish in a closet simply because people were afraid that if they stood too close to it, someone might ask them a question about it. There's also a critical corollary to this. Tip 5.1, create synergies between your equipment purchases. A digital conversion station is just a few pieces of equipment away from becoming a full audiovisual and music production environment. For example, a desktop computer just needs a simple video capture card or a USB dongle plugged into a VCR. Dongle, $50 to $100. VCR, basically free. And now people can easily convert their old VHS tapes into a digital format. Add in a scanner that supports negatives, and then you increase the potential uses for that station. Maybe you add in some video and photo editing software too. If it's a Mac, then iMovie and GarageBand are free. There's some great photo editing suites that are way cheaper than Adobe Photoshop. For example, Affinity is just $35. Maybe after that, you can add in a MIDI keyboard for less than $100. Now people can make their own songs in GarageBand. A USB microphone, like this one, pretty cheap. Maybe $50, and now people can do audio. And they can add voiceovers to the movies they're editing. An audio interface lets people plug in their own instruments. Those can be pretty affordable. Maybe think about adding a digital art tablet to help people do photo editing more easily. Remember that software you bought so people can edit their photos? Now artists can practice drawing with it, since you already got that same software earlier. So the point I'm making is that many of these steps can happen in any order, or even wait indefinitely until funding is in place for the next piece of the puzzle, or skipped entirely depending on the needs of your library. Look at the things you've already invested in and seek to expand their functionality through small, incremental acquisitions. Remember that point I made earlier about the importance of staff capacity and knowledge? It works the other way too. If you have a staff member or volunteer with a unique skill set, think about investing in that person to help them share that knowledge with other staff and patrons. I mentioned this a bit earlier, so here's a little more context. Google famously lets their engineers spend a large portion of their time on passion projects. And I think it's a great model for libraries to follow. Letting people spend time on things that they love doing improves job satisfaction, but it also enriches the variety of knowledge made available by the library. A knitting club is a lot easier to spin up when you already have a knowledge base to tap into. You can't buy that off Amazon. Tip 6. Hiding something in the closet is no different than it being broken, stolen, or not existing. Develop strategies to help ensure that your stuff gets in the hands of the people that will benefit most from its use. Make things available for in-house use by checking them out to patrons during visits. Or leave things out for passive programming, for example, by creating a station with a simple prompt that's appropriate to the thing. At the very least, think of ways to communicate to patrons that these resources exist and are available. For example, signs on the desk that say, "Hey, ask us about our widgets." Remember those Raspberry Pis we bought? We didn't have the resources to use all 10 of them for a library program. So instead, we circulated them as smaller kits in the community. This had a few benefits. First, we no longer had to worry about how we were going to buy and store 10 sets of HDMI monitors and keyboards. Second, it let people explore the technology at their own pace, in their own homes. Third, it helped us save face for buying a bunch of stuff that we hadn't adequately planned around. And that's tips 3 and 5. Sometimes stuff gets hidden away because it's too special to make available. I remember growing up, my mom bought a set of expensive china that we would only use for special occasions, on the grounds that she didn't want to lose a piece to accidental carelessness. I think I ate off those dishes less than 10 times growing up. When I visited home a few years ago, I noticed that she was using them for everything: backyard barbecues, late night scoops of ice cream, or morning bowls of Cheerios. When I asked what happened to change her mind, she confided that she had bought them to enjoy, but keeping them locked away kept her from actually enjoying them. Sure, some of this stuff is expensive. Yes, these things might be delicate, but so are many of the books, DVDs, and games we circulate all the time. Gatekeeping, excessive restrictions, expansive rules, they only serve to put up barriers, which implicitly reinforces the idea that some people aren't good enough to interact with your resources. The worst case scenario is where somebody eventually breaks something or runs out of the building with it, but that's functionally identical to never having let anybody use that thing in the first place. Looking back at my time spent working in a makerspace, I'm surprised how little loss we actually had. The most frequently damaged or stolen items were headphones, but we always bought cheap ones in bulk and otherwise encouraged people to bring their own. Other than that, I lost a couple of cheap guitars, a digital art tablet, but in the context of our overall budget, the volume of equipment that was on hand, the length of time under consideration, and the overall service environment, I think we did pretty well. At the end of the day, we put a lot of trust in our community, and it was well received. Tip 7. Keep your kids to kits ratio as low as possible. In a perfect world, every kid would get their own Goo God to futz around with. But that can get pretty expensive pretty quickly. Every additional child you assign to a kit during a program dramatically increases the likelihood of someone disengaging. It doesn't mean buy more of everything. You don't need a makerspace, and you don't need to blow the budget on 10 of everything either. Don't have enough of something? Here's a few ideas. 1. Limit attendance. This one's tricky because nobody likes leaving kids out of a program, but if you have enough resources to support around 6 participants, it might be better to cap the program at that number. Of course, you can also, alongside that, 2, run more sessions. This is time-consuming, but if you are running twice as many programs at capacity, you can also use this information to drive funding conversations down the road. 3, keeping in the spirit of tip 6, don't hide stuff in closets, find ways to make it available for on-the-floor use. 4, you can include adjacent technologies that support your outcomes. Tip 3 again. If your program involves getting a robot to make a shape on the floor, include other types of robots too. For example, if you only have one Sphero, or a couple of Ozobots, maybe a Dash or a Caterpillar lying around, have different groups try to solve the same problems with each one. Participants can then discuss the differences between each platform and the relative strengths and weaknesses of each. And if you can't find similar stuff to support larger problems, ask around. More on that later. Tip 5, make the program more project-oriented in order to accommodate a variety of different skills and roles. For example, if you only have a couple robots, one group of kids can focus on designing obstacles while other kids focus on programming. The more roles you can assign, the more engaged the kids will be. One of my favorite roles to give kids in a group project is researcher, where they're supposed to go from group to group, make observations, ask questions about what the others are doing and what's working well or not, and then bring that information back to the group to improve their own projects. And then finally, 6, you can stretch projects out over a longer time span to incorporate different aspects into the project. For example, one that they use in schools a lot is producing a commercial or a piece of video content. There's scripts to write, props and costumes to build, audio to record, video to film, timelines to edit. This has the added benefit of developing those larger competencies that I mentioned back at the beginning: problem solving, project planning, creativity. Also, connecting the work to a meaningful outcome creates an engaging context for the work. Tip 8. Don't invest in something if there are more important problems facing your library. Or, as Judith Logan and Kyla Everall from the University of Toronto put it in their paper, First Things First, Exploring Maslow's Hierarchy as a Service Prioritization Framework, quote, "Don't buy a 3D printer until your regular paper printers are reliable and easy to use." There's an endless list of competing priorities facing libraries, and even the most well-resourced library can find difficulty balancing all of them successfully. This is what I was implying at the beginning of the session when I perhaps unfairly characterized Makerspaces as resource-intensive money pits that present an enormous opportunity cost. There's a lot more that goes into a makerspace than just money. There's the physical space that these resources occupy, staff time, programming availability, training and development support. As you pursue supporting those outcomes, it's important to keep in mind the things that might be getting sidelined as a result. But again, if you take anything away from this presentation, it isn't you don't need a makerspace because it's expensive and difficult. It's you don't need a makerspace because there are other ways to create opportunities for people to come together to make things. It's not an either-or dichotomy to navigate. Remember tip 3. Once you have identified the outcomes you want to support, these conversations become an exercise in creative problem solving. One of the most frequent questions I answer is some variant of, I have just been put in charge of starting a makerspace. What do I buy? Or sometimes I encounter follow-up scenarios where someone inherits a closet of random tech that is gathering dust, wondering, what do I do with all this stuff? Both of these questions are grounded in the same assumption, that a makerspace is a list of stuff to have on hand. Don't get me wrong, stuff is good. I like stuff. But these questions put the cart before the horse. The stuff is a means to an end, and the first step is identifying what those ends are. To rephrase Logan and Everall, don't buy a 3D printer until you can clearly articulate what outcomes it is going to support, and make sure you keep your Xerox machine running too. Tip 9. Know where your library sits with respect to the rest of the community. I touched on this a bit way back up in tip 2. People teach kids to code. Make sure you consider all the options available in your community. Some community members have full wood shops in their garage. Schools have access to fully stocked art rooms. Local businesses might offer machining and metalworking services. Churches and community halls have full kitchens. Instead of duplicating services, think about how you can partner with an organization to develop programming opportunities that leverage the strengths of everyone involved. For example, libraries have done food literacy programming in conjunction with community kitchens. Libraries have offered classes on everything from starting seedlings, sponsored by a local nursery, to learning to knit, sponsored by a local fabric supply store, to bicycle repair, sponsored by a local hardware shop, to cooking classes, sponsored by a local restaurant. These classes offer practical skills and allow local businesses to strut their stuff while being good community partners. Sometimes the programming can even happen off-site at the place of business, further reinforcing the library's role as a community activator. Finally, tip 10. You don't have to go it alone. Look to other libraries for support on programming ideas, training, kits, shopping lists, equipment swaps. Remember tip 6 about all that gear sitting in closets for weeks or months on end? Float it out to other libraries. Coordinate purchases, work out joint custody agreements with libraries from neighboring communities. Communicate with your regional library system to plan for the next big thing that might support learning outcomes for a broad range of stakeholders. For example, 10 years ago when 3D printers started to go mainstream, the hype was that there was going to be one in every house. Since then, 3D printers are an order of magnitude cheaper, the one on my desk is $150, and are much easier to operate. And yet, despite this progress, I feel pretty comfortable saying that every home does not need a 3D printer. Why? Well, now lots of people know someone with a printer, or have access to one through work or school, or can just get their prints done through a commercial service. The same thing applies to all sorts of other equipment purchases in the library. With a bit of planning and communication, every library doesn't need its own printer, just like it doesn't need its own fleet of robots or whatever. Don't go it alone also applies to how you approach learning and supporting the exploration of all these potentially new services and pieces of equipment. One of my favorite mindsets for working on the cutting edge of library services is that of co-learning, where there are no experts or teachers, just individuals working cooperatively to try and figure stuff out as they go. Throughout this presentation, I've intentionally avoided the use of the word teach. It implies a highly asymmetric relationship that runs the risk of placing unreasonable expectations on people who are just coming into this knowledge themselves. Of course, I did use the word teach in Rule 2. Things do not teach kids to code, people teach kids to code, but this was only because I was pushing back against the hype that often confuses the things that support learning with how people learn. You don't have to be an expert at everything because there are tons of resources out there. All it takes to be a great co-learner is curiosity, a bit of patience, and the willingness to explore new stuff with other interested people. Let me put it another way using a Simpsons reference. Homer was worried about how they were going to make enough money to pay for something when Marge cheerfully volunteers to start teaching piano lessons. But Marge, you don't know how to play piano, Homer replies. Marge's response was, it's easy. I just have to stay one lesson ahead of the kids. Marge's plan may fall short of what it takes to be a teacher, but it's a perfect encapsulation of what it takes to be a great co-learner. Staying one lesson ahead might just mean watching an introduction video, or reading a Wikipedia article on something, or skimming a forum post about things I wish I knew when I first started out. The beauty of Marge's scheme is that she only has to commit just enough time to help her students along, and she inevitably learns something in the process too. The biggest problem in her approach is that she's misrepresenting herself as an expert. My suggestion is that we address that particular elephant in the room right from the start. Teaching requires a teacher, but everyone can be a learner, and we can all help each other be better learners. The more you can share that cognitive load with others, the easier it becomes to take more risks and try new things. So this brings us back to the beginning of my talk. STEAM programming and making in libraries isn't going anywhere. Libraries are, at their core, places of community learning. But you don't need huge budgets or dedicated spaces to support this kind of learning if you focus on the outcomes that you want to support and remember the purpose of a makerspace. The purpose of a makerspace is to present people with an opportunity to explore their interests through hands-on, creative projects. Makerspaces support a culture of curiosity and creativity, encouraging their users to take control of their relationship to everyday objects. You don't need a makerspace to do that because you already have a library. Anyway, thanks for your time. I'm glad I had a chance to share my thoughts with you. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me directly at bellers@yrl.ab.ca or my personal address, ben.ellers@gmail.com. I look forward to any questions, comments, and talking about this more. Thanks. Oh, my hair just got longer.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. That was really great. So I don't know if we have any questions that have come in yet, but if anyone does have any questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A or chat boxes, and Ben will answer them.
So the first one, what Lego kits do you recommend for programming? So there's a couple different platforms that are out there now that Lego's been at this for a while. The ones that I've had the most success with are the EV3 kits, just because they've been around for a while, and I think you can actually find them kind of discounted, especially through like Spectrum Nasco, now that they've been replaced by the new Lego Inventor set, or Mindstorms Inventor. Like I was saying in the video, the problem with the Lego Mindstorms Inventor is that you need very specific computers to run them on. If you have Windows 10 computers, that should work for most of the actual programming of them. We ended up getting one just for our own household, just to kind of play around with. And I have been really happy with the quality of the components. They've really rethought a lot of the pieces that goes into it and how the whole infrastructure works together. But again, there's that dependency element where you need to make sure that you have the computers that can support that. There's also sets that are geared towards a younger audience, including the Lego Boost kind of ecosystem, which is a little bit based more on like a traditional kind of Lego stacking blocks kind of building ethos. But most of that is app driven. So you need to have kind of like a nice stash of iPads to really kind of support that learning. If you can make it work, I do consider the Lego Mindstorms platform to be the gold standard for this kind of educational technology, just because it accommodates so many different types of building, from just building without robots, like I was saying with those kindergartners just kind of making little soapbox derby cars, up to kind of full on really international competitions for high school students on programming and engineering. So they're very, very flexible, and they are pricey, you know, but there's things you can do. Libraries have approached community partners for sponsorships, grants, things like that. And once you have them, they really support a huge range of learning outcomes. Let's see. Do you have any recommendations for actually hashing out your desired outcomes? So this one's kind of a tricky one. It does start with the idea that you need to have a, sorry, just one second. Sorry, my third grader just came home from school, so. Sorry, so it really is dependent on making sure that you have kind of the knowledge base to support the outcomes. Like, it's one thing to say like, hey, we're gonna teach everybody to be a web developer, but if you don't know anybody who has those skills, it doesn't make a lot of sense investing in those outcomes from the beginning. However, if you can do a survey of the community that's around you and figure out, you know, like who's in your environment, what skills they have, then maybe those are the outcomes you want to support. The best way to really build enthusiasm for something is to start with somebody who is enthusiastic about sharing that skill. Even personally, I've done programming where I was just kind of learning as I went, and I felt like the thing was kind of forced on me. And the quality of those programs were, I felt personally, never as high as the ones that started from like a deep-seated place of passion. So yeah, really it's just kind of having conversations and assessments of what's around you. And so it doesn't have to all be robots and technology. It can be literally anything. You know, and some libraries end up with like very robust fibercraft programs because, you know, they know a bunch of people knitting, and then they expand into sewing machines, and then, you know, you can kind of build on that nucleus to create something that meets the needs of their community. It's driven by the skills that are already present. Kyle asks, the simple screen capture dongle for equipment like hooking VCRs to computers. Can you elaborate more on what those devices are? I remember the $3,000 dedicated equipment for digitizing 15 years ago. Yeah, things have gotten super, super cheap. One of my favorites, I'm just going to Google it so I can get the exact name for it. It's called the Elgato Video Capture. Like, that's just the name of it. And sometimes it gets a little expensive due to supply issues. Historically, it's only been around $80, but right now it seems like it's gone up to about more.
How do you spell that, Ben?
Elgato, Elgato. And that was just one version of the hardware. It may not be manufactured anymore. But if you do Google Elgato video capture, there are a bunch of other competing products that are all very, very similar in terms of what they offer. And essentially, it's just a component connection, video, audio left, audio right. Sometimes there's an S-video connection, and then it just plugs into the USB. And after that, you essentially plug one end into the computer, load up the software, plug the other end into something with component out, which could be a DVD player or a VHS player, or even like little handy cams are really nice. Some people have those lying around that they have like old footage that they had recorded from the 80s and 90s. And yeah, just put it in, push the big red button and start recording. So may need to do your homework on that just to see which one's the best version. Sometimes I find that the software environment for the device is what really sets two different devices apart. Yeah, it's an easy way to get started, and then you can plug it into whatever piece of hardware you find either donated or purchased at like a secondhand shop, thrift shop kind of thing. Yeah, and the other thing that I like about the Elgato is it does open up other things, because then you have the scanner to it, and now you have like these different tools, and just by making these tools available, it kind of allows for new connections to exist between them. So like we had the video capture and the scanning software, and then somebody decided to put that together to make a family history home movie where they just kind of splice together photographs and video that they had encoded and then edit it together into a new movie that they shared. So it really kind of builds on all these different elements. And it, like I said, it doesn't have to happen all at once. It can happen just kind of piecewise as you go. Yeah, again, thinking about the objectives first, what is it that you want to accomplish? What's the grand vision? And then just kind of working out different paths to kind of get to that. Really helps you prioritize the acquisitions. Tips for trying to talk a manager director out of building a dedicated makerspace and library because they don't realize all the intricacies, issues involved, and needed staff capacity and training. That's a good one. And I may not be the best person to answer that because historically I've been on the other side of the equation where I'm trying to talk people into spending lots of money. That is a tricky one. I think really having kind of bringing the conversation back to those tips, knowing what the outcomes you want to support, because these things do tend to run the risk of people getting into the shopping list mindset that this is a problem that can solve just by like, here's a bill of sale that you need to, or a bill of materials that you need to get, and then you will have a makerspace. And it's like, it's not quite that.
And I think, like you said too, Ben, like a makerspace can be so many different things. Like there's no possible way you could have everything in your makerspace or in your library that would fit in that making kind of category, right? So, bring it back to your plan of service even is another great way of doing it, and what your community is looking for to kind of meet some of those needs that way as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. And some of those partnerships too, like if you can make sure that there are other groups in the community that are excited about the opportunities that these spaces provide, they can probably also help inform exactly what it is that they want to see. So I think it kind of depends on the space and the budget and the libraries, but really grounding it again, like in the plan of service and the outcomes that you want to support, and kind of working backwards from there. Like, what do we need to get there? So I sometimes feel that there's this field of dreams element to building makerspaces where like, if you build it, they will come. And sometimes that's not true. And sometimes if you build it, people do come, but then they're kind of confused because there's nobody there to help support the types of learning that makerspaces are there to facilitate. So it's tricky.
Awesome. Those are some really great questions that you had. If anyone else has any more questions, feel free to pop those into the Q&A. And then if there aren't any, we'll end a little bit early, but this was really great. And I hope everybody learned lots. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I did provide 2 email addresses. I am going to be vacating my current position at Yellowhead Regional Library and will be returning back to Edmonton Public Library just because of the terms of the contract. So you can use my personal address, ben.ellers@gmail.com. If you have any sort of like follow-up or shopping related questions, I'm more than happy to do deep dives into shopping lists and build carts and provide feedback and stuff like that. So
Awesome.
yeah, it's kind of fun. So
Are you going back to the Makerspace at EPL?
no, I was going to, but my new position will be as community librarian for Whitemud Crossing. So,
Nice.
but I'll
Awesome.
still be available and
Yep.
excited to help out about this stuff. So.
We have a question in the chat box. Is there a list of resources you could direct us to, or even examples of different makerspaces?
I don't have anything prepared offhand. Sometimes these things are very much kind of budget. There's so many different competing platforms in any different space. So it's really hard to say like what the one best thing is to buy for any different things. I have in the past put together a list of resources for things like recording studio equipment that's useful, filming equipment. I just had a column that Kaylee shared, I think in April, on like kind of considerations for video production. As far as examples of different makerspaces go, and that was something that I left out of during my first draft of this conversation, was kind of looking at the different types of makerspaces. One thing that's really interesting about them is that in some respects, makerspaces have already been around for a really, really long time. It's just in the past we called them the art studio or the wood shop. It's just now all of a sudden we have computers and we think that they suddenly become this new thing, but really it's just a space to synergize learning opportunities by integrating different aspects of curriculum and all sorts of stuff like that. But the short version is there is no one representative makerspace. You know, it could be a really well-equipped wood shop that just has, you know, drill presses and lathes and stuff like that. It could end up looking more like an art studio with more crafts and kind of free play elements to it. And I think that's kind of what's nice about it is really, again, it's those 3 elements: people in a shared space, learning together. And I think if you have those 3 things, like that's really all it takes to kind of take a step back from that makerspace hype and start looking intentionally at, you know, what collaborative, socially motivated acts of creation do we want to support? Oh, thanks for the kind words, Kyle.
Awesome.
Yeah, but and again, don't hesitate to reach out. I like helping people through these conversations, and sometimes it's nice just to have somebody to bounce these ideas off of. So.